Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 12th episode of the Stack to You podcast. It's going to be a very different kind of episode this time. We are going to be discussing on the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar. And to do that, we have amazing developers from ThoughtWorks and also a couple of us who are ex-ThoughtWorkers. So they are Krishna, Nitya, Sendil, and Selva. So before we begin the discussion, let's all introduce ourselves. Who wants to go first? Krishna, you want to start?
Sure. Hey, I am Krishna Swami. I am in ThoughtWorks for almost 10 years. I'm a lead consultant.
Hey, welcome back, Krishna. Krishna has been on a previous episode. Thanks again for coming back.
So my name is Sendil. I work at a company called Rippling. It's a startup. It's a San Francisco-based startup. We have office in Bangalore. I was with ThoughtWorks for almost 7-8 years till 2015. And before this, I was leading engineering at a company called Simple.
Hey, welcome, Sindel. Nitya, want to go next?
Sure, Manoj. Nitya, I've been with ThoughtWorks for the past 10 years. In fact, I completed my 10th year on June 14th, and it feels like forever in ThoughtWorks now.
Awesome. Selva.
Hello everyone, Selva here with ThoughtWorks for about 12 years now. Developer, joined ThoughtWorks out of my college and stayed here forever.
Yeah, welcome all. Thanks for taking the time to talk about this interesting topic. So we have a couple of ex-ThoughtWorkers and majority ThoughtWorks bunch. So it's going to be an interesting discussion, I hope. So before we start, I think it would be useful for everyone who's listening to establish context on what the Tech Radar is. Maybe talk about how the Tech Radar is created, what the intent behind it is. Would any of you current ThoughtWorkers take a stab at it?
I'll take a stab at it. So, Technology Radar, it's a opinionated set of things which put together by ThoughtWorkers. So, whatever you see in the radar, it's all kind of used within ThoughtWorks, and then it's all bubbled up from the ground level, where we collect all the feedback on the various tools, frameworks, technologies, and then we'll bump it up, and then yeah, a set of people, Doppler, who put together and then publishes the radar, and that's how I do it.
Would you
Like
say
it's
that the primary intent is to communicate what ThoughtWorks and ThoughtWorkers are internally using, and then communicate that in a more opinionated way to the community? Would that be the
yes,
primary intent of it?
yes. Moreover, right, we are also saying that hey, this works, this doesn't work, and we tried it, and before you try it, right, have this particular caveat, or this really works. You also take it up and then you do it right. So those kind of things we want to say it with the opinionated thing. So that's the whole intent of it, right?
Okay.
To add,
So
um, to add to Krishna, we publish this every 6 months, and recently we reached the 20th edition, basically 10 years of Radar, and the current one is the one after that. And so, as Krishna mentioned, this is our way of saying that this works, and this is our experience with some of these tools and techniques and languages, frameworks. But what we encourage is everybody, every organization to try your way of putting these things together and identify what works for you. And more than the artifact itself that is generated by the end of Radar, we value the experience that goes into putting the radar together, and all the discussions and debates that happens in the meantime. So they also adds brings a lot of value and viewpoints from us, and I think it is applicable for anybody who's in the tech industry.
yeah, I think that's one key aspect of it, right? Almost everyone from the ground level is involved in creating the Tech Radar, and then it pops up, and then there is a summary view of it. So one thing that I wanted to talk about is, what does the Tech Radar mean to you? We can have it as a discussion, and probably I'll start. So during the time when I was in ThoughtWorks, obviously that was the first time that I came across it. It was the discussions that we have around which blips to be added and which one shouldn't be added, where it's to be placed, and all that. I think that itself, like what Selva is telling, there were a lot of interesting discussions over the years. And I always use it as a reference, even when talking to clients, talking to other developers, making some reference and so on. So it was a very useful tool. And even after going outside ThoughtWorks, I've referred to it a lot of times, passed it around to colleagues and other folks that I interact with. And we also made a stab at our own tech radar, which we maintain, and I think we have published it as well. But the intent of that was also very similar, but at a more smaller scale, for us to first clearly communicate what are the tools and techniques that we follow internally within our organization. I think the key takeaway for me is ThoughtWorks is doing a great job with the tech radar, but it might not be useful for everyone. But follow the idea behind it, and maybe even set up tech radar within your own organization. Maybe you don't have to publish it externally, but keep something internally so that everyone within the organization, especially as it starts to grow, are in sync on which ones to use and which ones not to use, and so on. So that's my own take on it. Anyone else wants to talk about it?
Yeah, Manoj spoke exactly whatever I wanted to speak. So just adding to that, like, so after I left ThoughtWorks, it became one of the things to get to know the tech world in terms of like what is going on and what we should stop, etc. The opinions are I can mostly relate to it and I can align with it. So more than all these things, I think what it gives is the framework for thinking of your technology roadmap within a company, right? So things within your company, there are only 4 categories probably, like hold versus assess versus adopt and trial, right? And that gives you different way to that gives you sort of framework for you to drive changes across the company. Like there are enough interesting people who are coming with new ideas, then you're almost deciding between whether it is a assess or a trial or adopt. And in the current tech stack, what is hold? So that with that, you can drive some changes within the company. That framework is far more valuable.
So to me, there are 3 things that comes to my mind. One, when I'm part of a team or when I'm having a discussion with the team, and when we start collecting blips for the tech radar, the team kind of gets excited, right? I mean, this is this blip collection season, and we have tried so many new things. Some things have worked, some things have not worked, and let's go and publish it to the world, or publish it within ThoughtWorks, and I mean, make that change happen, right? The team getting excited and contributing is one. The second, when it's a new project, or when even the existing project, once the tech radar gets released, I mean, it's very difficult to have conversations with everybody across the world, and you get to talk to Krishna, probably get to talk to Selva when when you're part of a team, but then you don't know what are the various other things being tried out within ThoughtWorks itself. So tech radar is definitely one brilliant way to know what are the various things being tried out and how people see it, and can I go ahead and use it on the projects, or can I even suggest it to the clients. And the third thing is, I mean, in both the projects that I've been, at least the current one and the previous one, in both the accounts, they have set up their own radar. And when the clients come back and say that ThoughtWorks Tech Radar has definitely been an influence for me to come up with this own radar, and then they keep maintaining that, and they talk about it to their clients or within the organization itself, that is kind of a proud moment to be a thought worker. So probably these are 3 things me as how I look at tech radar.
Yeah, great summary, Nitya. I think that gels with at least a lot of you. At least when we were in ThoughtWorks, I think I had the same perspectives as well. Yeah, and the other thing was it was also nice when you create a small open source project and suddenly you might see it on Tech Radar. Being within the company makes it much easier to surface it sometimes. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
So, I think as you mentioned, right, it's a great reference point for most of the things. Whatever you are new, or if you want to learn something new, right, it's a great starting reference point. So other exciting thing for me, right, whatever blip we are surfacing from the ground level, right, whenever radar is out, I'll go and see whether that blip is there or not. So that's a very nice moment. Yeah, this is what I suggested, it's there. So it's a very nice moment. And the last time, right, in this particular tech radar, one particular point of running stateful and Kubernetes, right, that's our team kind of bubbled it up and it went so high, and then people asked multiple conversation, and then we were able to precisely say what we are trying to say in some 3 or 4 sentences, whatever we experienced for 2 years, right? We are able to put it out. It was a very nice thing.
Great. So yeah, I think we have set pretty much good context on what the tech radar is and what it means to each one of us. And so I think we can start off by discussing the main themes around the tech radar this time. So just to start off with the first one, the elephant in the Zoom. I think it is a very appropriate one for all of us at this point in time. Everyone is working remote. So let's have a discussion on how. I don't think there is any question around it. Everyone is going to accept this. So how is remote work going for each of you? Probably start with Selva.
Sure. Yeah, I think one thing is want to highlight is intentionally doing remote is different than forced to go remote. But as necessity is the mother of all innovation and right. Um, this whole COVID situation has shown the tech industry that working remote is possible. It is definitely different than intentionally doing and teams working remote, but this gave an opportunity, a forced opportunity perhaps, for all the different organizations that are out there to try this. And from whatever that we are seeing, people have made it work. Right, end of the day, that summarizes everything. Right. Of course, it is not a smooth journey for everyone. People, especially people with kids, where both the partners are working. Uh, it has been like a rough ride so far, but I think it gave a different perspective and different view of how to execute work, even in this kind of situation. Right? And it is a great learning for the tech industry, I would say.
Great. Sindhil, you want to go next?
So yeah, so I got fascinated with when I read the book Remote, like almost 5 years back when I was in ThoughtWorks, and we had a lot of conversations, like the things like how do you do pair programming, how do you do like our stand-ups, how do you do many of the like the process that we do, how do you going to do remote it was a hard question. And when you had a team structure in which like most of the people are working in office and there are few who are working remote, like that always we found it hard from both sides. People from office found it like it's very hard to communicate, and people in the home, from home people, they felt like most of the conversation they're missing the context that happens, which happens as in the office context, office setup. So somewhere and there are definitely very big, extremely successful remote companies which were also thriving at the same period. So it was always a kind of I was always curious about this thing. Like, yeah, it can work. It could work for the companies like that, which are doing similar work like us. Why wouldn't it work for us? And I also was confused. Like, yeah, it doesn't work when people are working from home, and these things makes it complex. So interestingly, for this new company, Rippling, I joined on the day March 16. That was my first day at company, and that was the first day for the company to go remote in Bangalore. So my onboarding, everything was remote. So far it's been really good. Like I think we are evolving the patterns in terms of asynchronous communication largely. Like when you're talking, probably you're writing, you're almost writing it down, you're conveying everything in one go. You're moving towards more asynchronous communication. And interestingly, our company also is present in San Francisco and Bangalore. There's a time zone difference, which and there are teams that are split between these two geolocations. So naturally, it puts some amount of work on insistence on the asynchronous communication. So far, it's been working well. But there are definitely downside, as Selva mentioned, in terms of it puts sort of more real estate pressure on the individual employees. They need to have separate place or separate room, set up their house, and things like that. And also, like, yeah, kids are also not going to school, so that's another pressure on us. So those sort of challenges are there, and definitely you're like the casual conversation that happens like when you're in office, like during lunchtime, you're like that socializing aspect is not there. You might have to ping somebody, and you don't want to say like, oh, like you don't want to set up a Zoom call for a casual conversation. So But those are also getting slowly solved. Like people don't find it awkward, like to ping them like WhatsApp, and then they are kind of trying to have some casual conversations. So far it's been good. I think it will continue to evolve. But yeah, inside summer you still miss the office.
So remote, I mean, I'm mostly a in-person person, right? Where I find it very difficult to kind of have conversations remotely. Of course, when it comes to clients, you don't have much of a choice. But yeah, after going remote, I think one of the most important things that happened, which we didn't want to happen, was our remote inception. Probably, I mean, others, Selva and Sendil did touch upon what was the effect of the working remote was to them, but I had a great learning from doing a remote inception, which was totally remote. I've done inception where the thought workers would be in one room, whereas the clients will be kind of at a different location. But the remote inception that we did was a very critical one, where all of us were remote, and it was for an IoT. It was for an IoT project, right? Where you need devices to be present with you for us to do spikes, and we had challenges of that sort. Of course, I mean, Selva was one person whom I tortured like anything. Krishna was another. Uh, I mean, overall, the end of the inception, we felt it was. We did have a lot of learnings. Of course, there were things that we have to learn from. There were failures as well. But then some of the learnings was one thing that the team improved as we went was facilitation. Right? Because in case of remote, with the inception like setup, it is very important for you to keep everybody glued to what you're talking, or the time is very limited, and people have to understand, and we have to move forward. So that was one, and the other thing that we also did uh, for us to not feel depressed, especially within the team, was we ensured that all of us are on videos. And the other thing that we keep doing every single day, at some point in time during the day, is we start playing fun activities, so that it is not work always, but there is also fun, and people don't miss, because there are a lot of folks from the project who are alone, who couldn't go back to their hometowns. So yeah, it is definitely a challenging time, but we did have our own learnings with respect to tech, as well as with respect to how to handle things personally.
Yeah, I think one important point there is taking the time to take care of each other in the team and making sure everyone is staying healthy and safe. Yeah. Krishna, you have any other thoughts to add?
Yeah, I'll say there are a lot of other things as well, right? Let's say we used to do a lot of community events like Geek Night or all. So now the boundary of office itself is gone. So there is no point saying that Chennai Geek Night or Coimbatore Geek Night, Gurgaon Geek Night, right? There's no point saying that, because everybody becomes remote, and there's no point saying that. So that brings a huge challenge now, because previously we don't even care, right? Okay, Coimbatore is doing it on last Thursday, we are doing on last Thursday. Doesn't matter, because people used to come to office. Now the same time is going to taken by two different offices, and we are going to connect on the same day, right? But for people, right, it's going to be looking like one Geek Night, right? So those are different challenges now we need to start facing, and a lot of remote workshops happening. So whatever we felt like it was not possible, it was now possible. So that's what I wanted to say. One thing which I wanted to add.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. And for me personally, I've not been attending a lot of meetups or conference, but now with everyone remote, everything happening remotely, I think the barrier was actually physical presence and not about talking about something or going and talking somewhere, right? So being remote, I'm like more motivated to at least try and submit more talks to conferences and so on. The very important realization has been it was not about laziness to prepare for talks or something, which I thought was the main reason, but it's actually the physical barrier due to
Yeah.
constraints and so on.
And one more thing, if you look at it, right, all these conferences, if you look at it, right, the actual fare for the conference is very less, but the amount of time you need to travel, accommodation, food, all this is going to be the very higher budget. Right now, you can afford to attend a lot of conferences at your home. right? Either KubeCon for whatever be it, right? Upcoming one, you can actually do it from home. If it's going to be $1,000, yes, that's the only amount you're going to pay, not for the travel, visa, all those things you will have to pay for.
Yeah, and the cost of the conference, running the conference, right? That has also come down significantly because the organizers were again factoring in, accommodation for the speakers, their travel tickets, etc. Whatever the conference that used to be like $1,500 are now like $200, and I think it has become more affordable for developers from different parts of the world.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how it evolves, because I think most of us will agree the biggest part of the conference is the socializing and talking in the aisles and so on, right? It's not actually the talks. Even I would say I will skip a lot of them if I do attend any conference, and then socialize with people, talk to them, see what is happening. And the talks are also going to be available online in most of the cases anyway. So it will be interesting to see how that evolves. So if there is going to be like a percentage of conferences going towards remote, but some others saying this is how conferences are supposed to be, it'll be interesting to see that. And for me also personally, I think like most of you have said, just to summarize and close it off, yeah, I think it has worked surprisingly well. But the bottom line is we are all working remote during a pandemic in unprepared situations. So I think everyone is just making the best of the situation. And it would have been interesting. I think the main issue would have been hybrid remotes with part of the folks in office and part of the folks remote, because that's where everything, the impedance mismatch comes into play. Right now, say you have to get into a call, wait for 5 minutes for everyone to come up. That's not going to be a big deal. But if you're in the office and all of you are there and one person who's remote takes 5 minutes extra to come up, that might seem like a big deal to some of it, right? I think being in the same situation across everyone is facing the same thing, everyone is doing the same thing, and everyone is having the same constraints. That also probably puts a different mindset for folks. So it will be interesting to see how this evolves as some folks start going back to offices. Already starting to happen for some of us, at least. I think our offices have started in Pune. So it will be interesting to see how that evolves. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. I think let's rush through some of these based on time. So Access Software 2. I think the theme is around managing things more from a software engineering perspective. I think in the work that we do in industry, there are certain aspects that are not treated in the same way as normal application code or whatever. Say, for example, the infrastructure management, I think, which we have seen a lot of evolution with the coming up of Terraform, infrastructure as code, and so on, and also things around ML, pipelines and all that, right? Pipelines were just configured in some place, and then data pipelines will run. But now we are also seeing cases where the CI pipelines, the data pipelines, everything is also being managed in code. GitOps is also a new evolution that is happening. Yeah, I think I gave more details on it, but anyone wants to add a bit more into it? How do you see this? I think the crux of it is treat everything as a software engineering discipline. That's how I'm seeing it. Anyone see it a bit differently? How it is?
Yeah, precisely, Manoj. So, even if you're doing infra code, for example, if you're writing Ansible code or Terraform code, you're not going to be following the good software practices like version control, right tagging when you're making releases, or even doing simple things like linting, right? You have to apply all the practices and simple tools that you use for software development to these as well, right? Unless, just like the any code can go messy over time if you are not treating it well, the same can happen to code or pipeline as code or anything, right? I think it is to just emphasize that it's not enough if you're just doing infra as code or pipeline as code, but also you should give the due diligence and the time, the effort to refactor, keep it well maintained. All those things that you do for a regular piece of software, you have to apply the same to this code as well.
Yeah, so I think one perspective related to any infrastructure code is like giving like almost like a normal thing. It's like table state now. So one perspective is that like software is nothing but a process or knowledge written in such a way that the machines can understand so that it can be automated. Like that's all it is. Right? So if you're just talking from a microservices parlance, like you consider you have a bunch of services and there is a common knowledge, which is during build time you require it, like you extract as a library. And that's then you manage that with versions, and you manage the dependency explicitly in code in package JSON or like whatever the version or whatever the dependency management. If it is a runtime you require it, you probably extract that as a service and one more microservice, and you are maintaining that versions as a API contacts and things like that. The same way, I think infra also, that's a knowledge, like how do you going to create a service, how do you going to deploy and all those things. So now I think that should be extracted as a lifecycle dependency, and that can have its own versions. And you are going to deploy, like for example, you are deploying in version 1 someday, and then you're going to release a new version, and you're going to use that lifecycle dependency as a version. And so I see infra as a code as a way to kind of this natural extension to the build time dependency, runtime dependency, and it's a lifecycle dependency.
So I may not talk about infra or even pipeline as code when I talk about X. Probably this applies to the hardware and devices as well. Right? So you also write software within the hardware, and sometimes when it comes to embedded systems, it is a lot complex and lots tricky, and due diligence is not done to that or given to that. Good engineering practices are not applied to that. But that also goes through, though it's a little, it also goes through the same stages. So I mean, you can replace X with the not just with software, but anything that goes through this entire cycle, for that matter.
Yeah, good point. I think. Yeah. Anything to add on this, Krishna?
Yeah, I think most important point where what the kind of confidence what you'll get with the code, right? You can actually use it multiple times. You can use it to create another infrastructure very easily. So without that, right, this will start happening. Hey, it used to work in mine. Go and configure here. Go and configure there, right? So those kind of argument may not work with this software as a code, right, or anything X as a code. And if you start following all the engineering practices, yeah, as long as Selva said, right, it should be also refactored and also could be should have to be kept clean. Otherwise, that also will start showing that kind of problem. If you have all those things, then definitely it's going to help you to have a lot of confidence when you're actually in trouble or when you have a release next week, right? Then will you realize the value of all those things, whatever you have with you. Until then, you'll not even understand the value what is going to bring.
Awesome. So let's move on to the next topic, which I think is sort of related also. Data perspectives maturing and expanding. I see it almost as an expansion of Access Software 2 into the data and ML space and bringing more rigor into it. And yeah, the main things that I wanted to talk about in this perspective are things around experiment tracking, CD4ML, and it gels very well with the previous topic as well. So we are also using currently MLflow to track our experiments with ML. I think once we started introducing that and started getting some rigor into it, treating it as a normal software engineering project, attack things with whatever learnings that we have from normal software engineering CD for apps and web apps that we do. Once we started getting into that rigor, right, things fell into place and started to look much better than what they used to be from where we were with respect to confidence of what we are delivering, how we are delivering, and so on. Those are the main items that I wanted to talk about on this topic initially, at least around experiment tracking with MLflow. I think even recently we have started using SageMaker Studio since it's making life a bit easier on the AWS side of things, and starting to see if we can also use SageMaker's experiment tracking features as well to see if it has any additional features without us having to manage it, right? So yeah, any other thoughts on this? So I think the main key items that are being talked here are the language models around BERT. Anyone has any thoughts on those? We are personally using BERT and a very tuned version of it called Distill BERT, which is like a more faster version with a slight decrease in performance metrics, but faster from training as well as prediction time. and using it with PyTorch, and we can see a lot of improvements from managing fast text models to now moving on to the more advanced models. Anyone has any experiments with data mesh, which is one of the items in the topic?
Yeah, honestly, I've not personally experienced data mesh, but it is certainly gaining a lot of traction among large enterprises where they have to deal with very different domain models in various teams, right? And one single data lake is going to not solve a lot of problems for such kind of thing. It can solve some of them, but it is still going to have the usual problems of typical, uh, what you historically have like a data mart, right? But with data mesh, basically, we are trying to apply the whole concept of individual teams owning their own data models, even for data lakes. Data lake do exist, but it is sort of a federated model where each team gets to own and manage their own data and workflow lifecycle. But what is key for uh, you know enabling these teams to do it in a way where things are not repeated among the different teams is to have to have like a platform like layer even for data, right? And this platform is leveraged by the individual teams in a self-service manner to provision their own pipelines, their own ways of building and refining models, etc. Such way that each team have the cross-functional skills to do all these things on their own, which I know unblocks themselves to move faster, but at the same time without repeating or creating waste at the end of it. That's the crux of it. If you see, there's nothing new in terms of concept with the data mesh, but it's just marrying the good practices of a platform and the data lake so that it works for large entities.
So, from my understanding, can we say like monolith is to microservice, data lake is to data mesh? That's what we are talking about here essentially. And
That's one dimension. Again, also marry the platform angle of it and self-service nature of infrastructure. Combination of all of these things.
So, in fact, for one of the clients, the major focus has been data, or rather, anything that they're doing in their organization is to collect a lot of data so that they can improve based on that. And currently, the structure that they have is a centralized data team, right, which does everything, gets the data, and then does. Though it started with just building some reports, it is actually applying a lot of machine learning algorithms and things like that. What we are trying to do is, and especially with data mesh, it is not just an architectural thing, right? It is actually an organizational shift itself, because the organization has to understand the benefits of doing that, and even the way the team gets structured, like Selva mentioned, it's a lot different. It the the team not just owns the product, it also owns the data. Probably that is the first realization, and that is when you can make the data mesh even happen. So what we have started doing, what we have started doing is not making all the teams to go through that, or rather get into the data mesh model, but start with a single team which will own the data, which will own the product itself, and that team will ensure that it acts as that the product team which will push the data, and build that platform like what Selva mentioned, where the other operations happen, right? And it is a large thing for the shift or the paradigm shift to even happen. And the good news is, it is happening, or it is working, and the organization does understand as to why this is needed and how it will impact. So that is definitely a good thing that we see. And also the side benefit of this is, the team also gets to know, gets to work on some of these areas, right? Rather than, if the team builds a product which is web based or mobile based stuff, they also get to work on the data side of things, which is, we as thought workers generally love it, working on multiple areas. So far, it has been successful, and the organization is also trying to understand, but it is definitely a bigger shift to happen across the organization.
Yeah, cool. I think we touched upon most aspects of this topic. So let's move on to the next big one, Kubernetes and Cambrian explosion. I think a lot of us should be touched by Kubernetes in some form, maybe except Sendil. And so, do all of you have been working in Kubernetes? So, what would be the general takeaway on this? I think so. I personally started working when with Kubernetes when it turned 1.0. Been working with it since then. At that point in time, previously we had a orchestration system with Mesos and Marathon. And as soon as I started reading up with Kubernetes, it felt different. And I could see a lot of promise with it because of the declarative way, with the abstractions that it provided, with the services deployment and all that, right? It was a very market difference, especially for those who are looking at Marathon, where you struggle to expose apps, manage ports. Like if the person deploying has to even take care of ports. And the first thing that Kubernetes addressed it was each pod can as its own IP in its networking, right? And then any person can deploy their app with any port. Like a very simple detail is already addressed, and I could see a lot of such things in the way that the resources were maintained, the way that they designed it, the APA and so on, and that was very visible even at 1.0. And yeah, I think now in 2020, it seems like everyone and their grandmom is also talking about Kubernetes. So yeah, so any other perspectives on this?
More than Kubernetes being an orchestration, right? I really like their API design and then what they're trying to solve, right? So far, whatever tools we have, say configuration management tool, Chef, Puppet, whatever be it, right? You can't say that I need a Postgres exactly in a simpler way, right? You have to put in a lot more things you have to do it, right? It's not a declarative. But what Kubernetes brings in is very, very interesting stuff, right? You just say that, hey, I need a pod, I need a deployment, I need a replica. So you don't even care where it runs, how it manages, right? So it is a very, very different perspective which actually brings that in, right? And now you can take that and you can put it to a lot of other stuff, right? Now, if you do the same thing, load balancer, I don't even care. Hey, how you go and create a load balancer, I don't even care. I just want a load balancer, you go ahead and create it. I will just declare an ingress, you go ahead and figure out whether you use Nginx HA proxy, I don't even care what you does, right? So that kind of abstraction is what I really like about the Kubernetes itself.
Yeah, and if you see all the tools that has emerged around Kubernetes, like whether it be service mesh or API gateways, load balancers, or log aggregators, all of these things again shows how extensible the Kubernetes ecosystem is, right? And how it encourages all these different tools to play along instead of Kubernetes itself trying to do everything. Of course, Kubernetes does a lot of things, but the beauty is it still allows a lot of extension points and a way to plug your own approach, your own way of implementation, and Kubernetes just stays at the declaration level for these kind of things. And the best example is Ingress. Right? The cloud providers are able to provide their own load balancers as simple Ingress implementations, by which it works for the cloud providers, it works for the developers, infrastructure operations folks, everybody. Right? I think that's one of the beauty that has made it work.
Nithya, you have any experience with Kubernetes?
I have tried, but not to the extent of Selva or Krishna. Krishna, I'm sure, not sure about Selva, but then Krishna would have tried anything and everything under the Kubernetes sun. Yeah, not to the extent of Krishna and Selva.
If you want to know more about Kubernetes, Krishna and Manoj have done a podcast, and along with Nathan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that as well. Sendil, how does it feel to not be in the Kubernetes land? Maybe you can give that perspective.
It feels good actually. Like I don't know Kubernetes, and see honestly, why we didn't try Kubernetes like 4 years back? Roughly 4 years back when I was in Simpleware building the things, because like there was no DevOps team, like zero DevOps team, and we had to, and there was no managed Kubernetes service available other than like the Google one. So in AWS there was no managed Kubernetes available, and we didn't want to move out of AWS for this. So we took ECS, and ECS, I mean, for us, like it is benefited almost, we could get almost everything running with ECS. Interestingly, that so now I'm hiring some people for infra team, and I'm trying to meet people who are from different folks. And there was one person from Coinbase infra team. I met him for hiring. And so they were talking about, and they were they were also on ECS, and it's a rare emotion to connect two people who don't know Kubernetes, who probably don't even care about Kubernetes, and connect and kind of bitch about Kubernetes, because we don't even know, so it's very comfortable. Otherwise, I will.
Coinbase even recently blogged about why they are not on Kubernetes, right?
Yes.
That was making waves. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting perspective. I don't know how much of that is really really a perspective in terms of like with managing Kubernetes versus like complexity of using Kubernetes. Yeah, so that's a small minority that exists, who don't care about Kubernetes or who don't use Kubernetes.
No, I think we actually live in a bubble. I think bigger majority probably doesn't care about Kubernetes, but we care about it. That is what I feel also.
I think definitely not
yeah.
everybody needs Kubernetes, right? So they all might have 2 or 3 microservices, right? I think so. The moment you have microservices, then whatever you have to do itself is to do. You have to do a lot more, right? So microservices itself is a bubble, if you ask me, right? I don't know when that's going to burst, and people feel like monolith seems to be a very, very easy thing, right?
Yeah.
Because managing microservices is not easy, right? You have to put in a lot more other layers in front of it, or a lot more other layers after that you have to manage. So all those things are there. Yeah. So, but what I was saying is, right, all those things, if you have multiple microservices, you have a lot more things, then the advantage of Kubernetes is going to kick in, and you will actually really benefit from that.
Yeah, and go ahead, Nithya.
In fact, I mean, like I mentioned, I haven't explored Kubernetes to an extent of Krishna, or rather, I mean, I'll not even come where Krishna is, right? But even in the current account, there have been conversations about should we bring in, should we not bring in. But like what Krishna mentioned, is it even necessary for the kind of thing that we are doing? We felt it is not necessary, at least right now. We would definitely look at it when there is definitely a need, or when it warrants to bring in Kubernetes. We felt probably for the use case that we are talking about is, let's not get started at the moment. So probably that's the reason we didn't explore Kubernetes, at least for the project that we were.
Yeah, there is a simple aspect to it, right? Like not all applications need to or even can run in an efficient way within containers. That is the rules of Kubernetes for a lot of folks, right? So, and for even though Krishna is doing a lot of work with stateful applications, I myself am more comfortable in stateless applications, small microservices being in Kubernetes, and then others better be outside Kubernetes. And that's how we have been approaching it for a long time as well. So I think even there is the other perspective is not everything that you do needs to be in Kubernetes. Some aspect of what you do could be in Kubernetes. But we can also say that some people say, I'm going to get Kubernetes experience anyway, I have to manage it anyway. So then why not put everything into it? So I think there are lots of different viewpoints around it. But one thing is for sure, Kubernetes is everywhere, at least in the bubble that we see. I'm not sure how much of a big bubble it is, but from what I could at least see, a lot of folks in software world are touched by Kubernetes in some form. Yeah.
So I'll feel this way, right? So either Kubernetes is going to be a great thing or not, but definitely the way the API structure or the way you define things is there, right? That's going to be get abstracted even for VMs. That cycle is going to go back to even to the VM world, and then you will just simply say that I need this, and it will be running as a VM, or it could be run anywhere, any cloud. So I think it will go that direction rather than Kubernetes is going to be a bigger bubble.
The interesting thing with Kubernetes is that it created a very, very nice abstraction that which is sort of memory neutral and things like that. But what it gave is that, like, on top of it, like for example, the Kubernetes based CI tools, CD tools, Kubernetes based like GitOps tools, and there are anything like any new tool if you want to try previously, like just like Docker. And if there are a bunch of services you want to run, like they are giving you Helm chart to just quickly launch that. So it has created a fundamental grammar in which like more people are actually starting to speak the language now.
I think let's move on to the sections around techniques, languages, tools, and so on. I think we can make this a quick one. I don't think a lot of it has been very controversial. Maybe things that we probably disagree with or want to highlight a bit more, maybe we can go through it in detail. So on the technique side, I think we have addressed a lot of things around CD for ML, infrastructure as code. One thing that I wanted to ask about is, what do people think about GraphQL? To start off, like, we do use GraphQL, but there is also both pros and cons to it that we started realizing, because it doesn't work as is without using some specific libraries around caching. Like, performance is also a deal. But what I found it is, UI development with GraphQL is like one of the best things ever. Right? You give the GraphQL API to say, especially if you have like a separate person who has to work on the UI, give a lot of context, and then it really opens up to them whatever they want to do, right? It's like opening up. You design the UX based on whatever is available without having to coordinate back and forth with exposing an API. That was one of the things that I found to be eye-opening for me when we developed a tool UI for it with the GraphQL API in picture. Like, the person just ran with it and came up with multiple different ways of doing things just because the API was there. Because a lot of times if the API is not there, some things are not experimented at all. And sometimes you don't know whether it is possible or not. And if the person is not fully into what is happening in the backend system, they may not know what can be extended and what cannot be extended. So that was an interesting takeaway for me on that project. But it also has some of its cons around caching, managing things correctly, like the recursive queries and how deep it can go and all that. Right? That requires some work at least. Yeah. Any other thoughts around GraphQL?
Yeah, similar thoughts, Manoj. In fact, if you have come across backend for frontends, I've done backend for frontends. Anyway, teams were like coming up with their own hack on top of REST to consolidate the different requests and then give like one response to to the browser, right? And GraphQL simply gave a standard convention for doing that, especially when you use it as in the backend for front-end layer. Right? And now the front-end developers or even third-party teams who are going to consume this as this universal language, you get a schema definition. Now plug in feed it to the client library. You don't have to write the boilerplate code to make it all work. Yeah, GraphQL for any other places, for example, between service to service calls, probably I would say stay away from it. I think REST or even other things like gRPC has its own place over there. But especially for the front end development in the BFF layer, it is great. And we have been having a very successful use of it. And in our case, and it so happens to be that in a part of the large product development, there are multiple backend services, like 50, 60 different services. But the front end teams or separate teams, they are this API is being part of a platform. Different solutions for different products are being built, and always there was trouble of which API, where should I go, how do I perform batch operations. Like I have a list page with a list of product items. Now do I make n+1? GraphQL addresses that, but the catch is like we don't want to just shift the n+1 problem to the backend. That is the part. That's the caveat that you have to watch out for. It is very easy to get into do n+1, doing n+1 without even knowing it. I think that's where you have to be very watchful about. And all the standard techniques like profiling, monitoring, should be applied for GraphQL layer as well, so that you watch for these kind of patterns and over time you improve it to not impact the performance.
So, I think Selva covered pretty much everything that some of it that I wanted to say. So, uh, we use GraphQL extensively, but for the reasons mentioned by you, Manoj and Selva, with respect to caching and performance, we stayed away from using for server-to-server communication. But for BFF, especially from a mobile standpoint, where versioning and things like that become a lot critical, right? Wherever versioning comes into picture, you end up doing versioning because things have changed. You can't make it. I think, I mean, that in the context of BFF makes a lot of sense. And that is an area where it has shown its benefits. So we have tried avoiding for server to server, but BFF, yes, I think it's clearly a winner of sorts.
Great. One thing that I want to touch upon is Gitflow. I think they made a lot of controversy back in the day when they introduced the branching concept and all that. And now, thankfully, they said that was not our intention, especially for web applications. So whoever was following Gitflow and who didn't agree at that point in time, stop doing it for the wrong reasons. I wanted to highlight that because it was one of the interesting conversations that, and probably one of the first controversies that I was part of in Twitter at that point in time. So it is good to know that
Right.
the people who created it themselves have said it's been misunderstood in a lot of ways.
Yeah, especially within ThoughtWorks, all the teams are huge proponent of continuous integration, trunk-based development. Gitflow has been major no item. But again, with pair programming, trunk-based development, all of these things, right? Gitflow is completely not in line with any of these things. But also, large enterprises again have been following it purely because it established one convention across. And any such convention, when it is not practiced without understanding the underlying meaning, right, it is going to have this problem. The industry has been going through the cycle that I now found the balance between these two.
Cool. In the interest of time, let's go through some of them quicker. So tools, the main tools that I wanted to mainly touch upon are Cypress. I think from testing perspective, it has been not a revolutionary, but a small evolution of tools that were there, but it makes every aspect of it much more simpler, much more easier, much more efficient. So whichever area, like writing the test, running them, seeing how it is working, how to configure browsers, everything is being taken to the next obvious level. It's not a huge jump, but as an overall package, it does come across as like a huge jump because every area they have made sure that it's slightly better, and now the whole synergy of it, right, has been pretty good. That's been my personal experience on it, and I think we have touched upon other topics around experiment tracking and so on. So Apache Superset is something that I wanted to try out. Selo, did you have any experience with that?
Okay, talking about Superset, we had a brief experience with it. We are still exploring, whether we are going to be going with it. It is again for the case of data visualization analytics in the BI area. The main reason is, it has support for backends like Presto. Right? Otherwise, probably Grafana, Kibana, in similar category, like open source BI. I mean, Grafana, Kibana, not exactly BI tool, but they can also perform similar things. But Superset is again comes into the area where you need to do these kind of visualizations and analytics, but completely abstract the complexity of the underlying data store and the query engine. Right? I think that's where it has implemented a nice way of abstracting the details as well as the ability to add more backend implementations easily if you really want. But Superset is still in early stages. It is in the incubation stage, I believe. So it may not be as mature as other tools in the ecosystem, but it is really promising.
How would you compare it with Power BI, Selva? Have you tried Power BI? Because it also is something.
Yeah, commercial tools are going to be completely different league altogether. You may not be able to compare it at all. But again, I think this is a very good alternative that attempts to be in the space, but again in early stages.
That's good. So let's move on to platforms unless anyone wants to talk on something else. Platforms, I think the main eye-opening thing has been .NET Core. I think it's also come out as one of the top favorite items in the recent survey as well. And performance has been like almost there with all the C++ frameworks and so on. So I think it's a definite space to watch out. Anyone doing anything with .NET Core?
Haven't explored it yet, but we use .NET Core, not the latest one though. So we're planning to try it out in the next couple months and see we can give our recommendations to the clients. That is where it is.
Yeah, on the service mesh side, there is Istio, but my takeaway on it has been it's too complex. Like if people think Kubernetes is complex to a certain extent, you might not need it. I think Istio is going to be next level. So I've never touched it so far. Never gone into service mesh areas or things. Yeah. Anyone has experience around service mesh, Linkerd, anything?
This much, right? I have not fully tried, but there are a lot of things going on like Istio and then Linkerd and all. But personally, I like Linkerd a lot more than the other one because it's very lightweight and you don't have to run a lot of resources just for your service mesh. If you go with Istio, right, you have to put in a lot more CPU resources and memory resources just to have your service mesh up and running, and there are a lot of other things going on. So that's how I felt. And so unless you have a lot of problems, right, this is not going to bother you. But I don't know why people have started feeling like, hey, you need service mesh, you need Kubernetes, you need microservices and all. So unless you have a problem, I don't think you need any of that. Right. So that thing I think people needs to be watched for.
Right. Yeah, any experience with Argo CD? I think Selva, you have experience with it. I think it's entering into the GitOps new.
Right. Again, this is more of an experimentation rather than experience. So this is yet another way of doing deployments and monitoring your Kubernetes resources. Gives a nice view and gives a nice abilities to manage those as well. Coming from again GitOps approach, right? Again, it is looking one of the tools that is looking promising. I'm not sure whether I would recommend somebody to start with Argo CD to begin with, but probably if I've got like tons of Kubernetes clusters and hundreds of pods that are running, and we want a better way to manage those, probably you can start looking into something like Argo CD.
Right. Do you know how it compares with Flux? Which I think were the biggest, like where they were originating the GitOps movement, right?
Right. Not sure. Not sure.
Okay.
Not right that one.
All right. Yeah, this is something that I want to try out, and I think one of the next couple of episodes is going to be around GitOps, so I'll get more info on that. Yeah, any other platform that we want to talk about? Any other line item on that? All right. I want to mention one item that is on hold, which is node overload, right? Coincidentally, it was on front page. The exact blip was linked to on the front page of Hacker News today. So yeah, there was some interesting conversation around it. But I think even creator of Node has said in some form or other that there is node overload, and he has now gone on to create Dino, which also looks more interesting and especially intended at attacking problems that Node was creating for a lot of its users, and especially around security and what it is being used for and so on. So I think even the creator has said in some form that is the case. So nothing to disagree there. But I think Node has its place. Dino might also have its place sometime soon. I think it's always been about using the right tool for the right thing and using polyglot programming. Don't use Node for everything just because you know JavaScript, or maybe you think you know JavaScript. Okay, so let's quickly move on to languages and frameworks. So I'll start off with Vue.js. It's something that I've been using. I've done a bit of React before, not a front-end developer in any measure, but Vue with Vue CLI and Vuetify framework has been like pretty good. Because as a developer, I have a way of looking at things, and I think, okay, I can do this in this way, and I look at the documentation and it's exactly the way that I thought it to be. So in that way, with a little bit of React experience coming in, it made a lot more sense, and I can avoid JSX as well. So that was one of the highlights of using Vue.js. Any other experience with Vue.js?
Yeah, similar experience, Manoj, but I came from Angular.
Mm.
Angular 1, 2 times, not 6, 7 like how it is now.
That's almost like jQuery. No.
And Vue was such a refresher, where it is simplified but gets the job done. You have a very simple application where there are 3 components, it works. You have a complex application where there are 50 components, it does. And again, it has got the right ecosystem of tools around it, right? Whether you need plugins or packagers, anything that you need, I think Vue ecosystem, it has picked up a lot. This is a long time back. I don't know whether any of you remember Subhash. He introduced Vue to me, expert worker, and at the time he was completely teaching about React and the philosophies of React. And at the end of the day, it has proven so. It is such a refresher if you are coming into the front end world from any of the other frameworks.
Yeah, I'm also hearing a lot of good words around Svelte. So
Yeah, so we've used Svelte in the previous hour for rendering extremely lightweight UI. So I mean, we have very really good experience with Svelte because what it produces is a extremely lightweight UI, and still you get all the benefits of like that level of abstraction that you get from using frameworks.
yeah, I might try it out to see how it compares to Vue at least. I don't think I might move off from Vue, but a lot of cases, like even recently, we had a podcast around where people tried out Vue.js for 3 weeks or so. People with very similar experience as me were not typical front-end engineers, right? But not getting the sense of what they wanted to do and then moving over to Svelte. So it's something that I want to see to understand what the differences are. Yeah, really nice to. So moving on, any other line item here that we want to talk about? One of them is PyTorch. Um,
Probably
anything
I'd
you
like
want
to touch upon about Rust,
Yeah.
especially in the context of Rust as an alternate for C or C++.
Hmm.
Especially with a customer that I'm working for right now, where we had to work with a bunch of C and C++ code bases. One thing that we have arrived at after a lot of discussion and debate is not to build anything new on C, C++, but to consider alternative like Rust or Golang based on the situation. I think the same philosophy is being resonated among the community. Even Microsoft and Apple have made public statements about the same thing. They are not going to do any new development in C or C++. And that's a very major shift, especially for the industry that works closer to the hardware, right? As ThoughtWorks, many a times we don't do that, but there's a huge industry that is out there which builds software that runs closer to the hardware, and C++ and C just rules that land right so far. That Rust is completely changing that ecosystem, and hopefully it is good.
Yeah, I don't have any personal experience with Rust except reading things here and there. But interestingly, since we mentioned Dino is written in Rust to again to get the performance and to secure it and so on. Yeah, I think Rust is going to be one of the things to look out for. It might end up being one of the hyped languages as well, like we have seen many before. But I think it's going in the right direction. And yeah, I think Rust will have its own place, and Golang will have its own place, and the other more popular ones also will have their own place, I think. Go ahead. Yeah, so the other thing that I wanted to talk about was PyTorch. PyTorch, I think, is slowly gaining popularity in the industry. I think previously it was mostly being seen as an academic or a research focused one, especially when compared to TensorFlow. But I can see a lot more activity happening. We are personally with PyTorch, with BERT, using again Hugging Face transformers, and it's been very very productive to get into deep learning, NLP, and all that. Still early days, only in the last few months, but be good to see where we are a year from now. Niti, you wanted to add anything on this?
Yeah. So with respect to, I mean, I don't know if it's a bit of controversy, but TensorFlow being from Google generally gained a lot of traction. Probably that was the only thing out there. Like you said, PyTorch was mostly the experimentation or in the educational front, but it has been used in a bunch of production projects, and it has definitely proved it metal, right? And I mean, one of the most popular use cases that general people talk about PyTorch is it's being used at Tesla, and it is also known for its simplicity and performance, for that matter. And with respect, and from a developer standpoint, it is simple, and it is also the constructs that it kind of provides with respect to looping and actions. It's pretty simple. It's easier to debug, and that is also one of the reasons. So when somebody who has used PyTorch for some amount of time, when asked to compare it with TensorFlow, they generally prefer PyTorch because of especially because of the simplicity, and also because of performance.
Yeah, I think one place that PyTorch has been lacking and probably still is around the serving side of things, right? When you have a model, how do you serve it, especially with GPU? That has been things that I don't think worked out well, especially with relative to TF serving. But I think a lot of folks are working on it right on. I think even AWS works with SageMaker. Have done a lot of work around it. And that's where we are right now. We initially started with, let's not do too much into deploying it and just deploy it into SageMaker endpoints to make it simple. But now we are starting to take it over, and some of the improvements around PyTorch serving have improved drastically even from few months back. So yeah, I think things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, the other thing that they say, or at least I've heard, is now with the TensorFlow 2 coming in, it mimics a lot of what PyTorch but the biggest challenge with TensorFlow being its backward compatibility, right, with TensorFlow 1. So I mean, yeah, PyTorch is gaining a lot of traction for, I think, the right reasons.
Yeah, I think previously there was TensorFlow, and then but you have to have Keras to have some sort of syntactic sugar or easier to write API, which would be closer to PyTorch.
Yeah.
But PyTorch had added out of box, but now with 2.0 TensorFlow, it's Keras is built in. But I think the community is going to be split now because it's a breaking change in many ways as well. But I'm not an expert on that. I've never really tried TensorFlow, but this is all from reading. But I'm generally tending towards PyTorch. Yeah. Okay, I think that mostly covers it. I think it was a great conversation, and we have been overshooting on time. We all have to get back to our lives, interesting lives in times of pandemic. So without holding people. So any final concluding thoughts? Should we do this as a regular thing after every Tech Radar? Thankfully, it is only like once in 6 months, right?
Let's do that.
Yeah, sure.
It was brilliant, Manoj. I mean, even though we have not explored few of the other areas, hearing from the others was definitely useful for us to even go and try back.
Yeah, I think that's also, like we spoke, the intent of the Tech Radar, right? I think, and we are adding a small layer on top of it. So yeah, I think we are contributing towards that, and I'm also learning from speaking with a lot of different folks. Maybe the next version can be a bigger audience, a bigger set of folks. And one thing that I want to start doing is doing a live stream. Maybe the next one can be a live stream where audience can ask questions and so on. So we can answer. Okay, thanks a lot, folks. Without taking more time, thanks for that.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you.